This is Democracy Watch. Mark, all eyes are on Georgia right now. We have major news from the Georgia Supreme Court. Can you explain what just happened?
Yeah, this is a blockbuster ruling. The Georgia Supreme Court, which is very conservative, very Republican, issued a unanimous decision striking down in their entirety 4 different rules that were put in place by the state election board. You may remember this is that board where Donald Trump at a rally called out 3 of the members by name and praised them. This is the board that was promulgating rules to try to allow election deniers to refuse to certify election results. This is the board that had rules to try to slow down the counting process by having hand counting process. Well, they got sued. The Republican National Committee got involved in this case because they really wanted these rules to stay in place. And in a big surprise to a lot of people, myself included, they got shut out today in the state Supreme Court. 4 of those rules, the 4 worst of them, got struck down and will no longer be in force moving forward.
I do want to point out that this is not some liberal state Supreme Court. The Georgia Supreme Court is overwhelmingly conservative. I mean, the members were appointed by Republican governors who have consistently won elections in that state. And so what does it say that even these right-wing judges who populate the state Supreme Court weren't willing to stomach what the Georgia State Election Board was attempting to do?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, as you point out, there are 8 current members of the state Supreme Court in Georgia, 7 of whom were appointed by Republican governors. And, these, like you said, are a pretty conservative bunch. You look at some of their other rulings and you can see that they are pretty conservative. But in this case, they really went out of their way to say a few things. Number one, that there is a right to vote, that right to vote is protected by the state constitution, that the legislature can't delegate to this right-wing board the power to do some of the things they did, and that this board overstepped some of the authority, even if it was granted. So this was a really strong rebuke all the way around. I mean, the state Supreme Court actually overturned some prior precedent, saying that stare decisis, which is what causes courts to follow prior precedent, should not apply. So it literally, rewrote the rules in many respects about what cases they can hear, how things get decided, what the rights of individual voters are. And they did it in a case to really slam the efforts by the election deniers, backed by the Republican National Committee here, trying to get these rules in place. And, people may say, well, but that was 2024. That it doesn't matter. No, there are big elections coming up in the state of Georgia in 2026, including a very critical U.S. Senate race. So, this is no small matter. And I think what it says is that we see time and time again that even conservative judges and justices just don't want to bite off on some of the wackiest, craziest, conspiracy-laden, MAGA supporters who are in these positions of power.
So I feel like the next question that's coming, but in every instance where these MAGA Republicans don't get what they want, they either seek some method to appeal this stuff, although I'm presuming that because this is the Georgia Supreme Court, that's not going to happen, or to just outright eliminate the court's ability to even litigate these issues. And so we've seen numerous instances where states have begun to float the independent state legislature theory where the courts wouldn't even be able to have a say in what the legislature does. The legislature would basically be an unchecked power when it comes to how they litigate these election rules. And so is there some concern that just like the independent state legislature theory popped up in North Carolina and a few other states around the country, that Georgia Republicans are going to attempt the same thing?
Yeah, I don't think that is going to get any traction here, in part because, as you say, the state Supreme Court has already ruled. I don't think that the federal courts are going to get involved here. I certainly don't think the U.S. Supreme Court is going to get involved here. I think the question is, and this is what I'm watching, is does the legislature now get involved? Right. Because a lot of what the court said here was that this was an improper delegation of authority, that essentially this board took authority it didn't have or was given authority that
Can you give an example, for instance, of what the state election board was trying to do? They didn't have jurisdiction to do it, but that the legislature might.
Yeah. So, for example, one of the rules that was struck down is the so-called Dropbox ID rule, which required voters to provide a signature and a photo ID when dropping off absentee ballots at a Dropbox. Now, Georgia law doesn't say anything about any of that. This was something that the state election board had come up with itself, and it was struck down. Now, presumably, the legislature could come back into session now and say, we're going to enact that in a statute. The same thing with respect to the hand count rule. They adopted, the election board essentially created a right out of whole cloth for these electioneers at the county level to institute hand counts. That was struck down because, again, not in the statute, not something the legislature wanted. Well, the legislature could require hand counts under certain circumstances. So it's going to be a real test now to see what does the legislature do here, because this is very much a slap at Donald Trump. The Republican National Committee intervened in this case because it wanted these rules. And everybody knows they act as a proxy for Donald Trump. Donald Trump hates drop boxes. Donald Trump wanted and wants the ability of his electioneer supporters to be able to refuse to certify elections. That's something that was a priority of his before. And so the question is, does this legislature, that has a history of enacting voter suppression laws? Let's not forget, this is the state that brought us SB 202, the big voter suppression law in 2021.
Where you couldn't even give food or water to people in line.
Right. Does it now come in place and say, okay, you know what? We're going to now take these terrible ideas, these voter suppression, election subversion ideas, and we're now going to put them into Georgia law.
I mean, in a way, this is kind of a breeding ground. It's like this far-right little inoculated breeding ground for the worst voter suppression tactics that you could find. And sure, while they don't have jurisdiction, there, I'm sure, are many members of the legislature in the GOP who would be perfectly willing to pick up where they left off.
Right. And remember, this was the board that Donald Trump took time out of his rally from the stage to praise by name the very members responsible for these rules. So again, this is something Donald Trump showed a lot of interest in. Now, you could say that was before 2024 and now he cares less. I don't buy that. I think that he still cares about the 2026 midterms because he doesn't want a check on his power. But, at least for the time being, kudos to the state Supreme Court of Georgia for doing the right thing here. My hats off to the plaintiffs who brought this lawsuit. This was actually brought by a right of center organization initially. It was supported by many others, but they initially brought this. And so, good for them. And let's see whether it sticks.
Let's like zoom out 30,000 feet. When we see these efforts taking place by Republicans in one state, is there a situation where Democrats should be doing something analogous as a way for them to show, like, this is what happens when you have a faction of kind of like lawless sycophants attempting to consolidate power, and if you want to do this in Georgia, this is what you risk in a state that's some blue bastion? Or is this just the kind of thing? And the reason that I ask this is because, like, often Democrats will just good government ourselves into obscurity. For example, you see a bunch of Democratic states where we have independent redistricting commissions. Meanwhile, we've got Republican states where they've got their states gerrymandered to within an inch of their life. I mean, the only reason that there's 2 whole seats that are Democratic in North Carolina is because they couldn't figure out how to consolidate 2 metropolitan areas on completely opposite ends of the state. Otherwise, there would just be 1 Democratic seat with every blue voter packed into that one single district.
And by the way, that's not hyperbole. That is literally what the Republican legislative leaders said. They said the only reason why there are 2 seats is because we couldn't figure out how to gerrymander them out to make there be 1.
So is there an instance where Democrats should be fighting fire with fire here and kind of offer a warning to Republicans that if they continue down this path, they do so at their own peril?
Yeah, look, I think that there is a lot that Democrats could be doing to improve voting rights in states that are controlled by Democratic majorities. And, there are things that are very common sense that they could do to make it easier for young voters to register and to be able to vote, to make it easier for minority voters to be able to register. And I
mean, you've even sued New York, for example, to expand their voting laws.
Yeah, I had to sue New York to strike down a law that prevented providing food and water to voters waiting in line. Now,
Yeah.
I'd ask you, why on earth should I have to file a lawsuit on behalf of the NAACP of Brooklyn against the city of New York and the state of New York to strike down a law that prohibits the handing out of food and water in line? And by the way, before we filed the lawsuit, I called this out publicly to give the New York legislature a chance to change the law. After we filed the lawsuit, the New York legislature could have changed the law. The city of New York could have said, we're not going to defend the law. The state of New York could have said, we're not going to defend the law. But instead, we wound up having to litigate and litigate and litigate. We eventually won, and that's great. But, that shouldn't be the way it is. And we find ourselves oftentimes having to pull teeth with Democratic controlled places to simply make it easier for voting on places like college campuses. I hate to keep picking on New York. I'm from New York originally, so I feel like I have a little bit of leeway here. But I had to sue, I think it was Dutchess County 2 cycles ago because they wouldn't put a polling place on the campus of Vassar College, which is a state law. There is a state law that requires this. And so we continue to see this in blue states where they don't take advantage of laws that would enfranchise all voters in general, but in particular voters who tend to vote more Democratic, voters who tend to face more obstacles. Right. And so, I have zero tolerance for it, and it would sure make my job easier, and it would make Democrats' job easier and voting better if you had more Democratic states looking at their laws to try to figure out how to improve voting. I mean, Brian, I'd put it to you this way. You and I have come to expect that every year, Republican legislatures tinker with the law to target Democratic voters to make it harder to vote. We have just talked about them losing a landmark case in Georgia and how they may now go back. I hope they don't, but they could go back and tinker with the law to make it harder for people to vote. When was the last time you heard that Democrats every year are taking up voting to tinker with it to make it easier?
Yeah.
They kind of do like one and done maybe, but they don't view this as like a central part of their mission. And it's about time more states do. And, anything I can do to help you out there, state legislatures, just reach out to Brian. He knows how to find me.
I'll connect to you. Look, I think to your exact point, we need to be as aggressive in the expansion of voting rights as Republicans are with the suppression of it. And that means that every single year, if there's something else we can do to make it easier to vote and prevent Republicans from enacting their goal, which is to make it harder to vote, then that's exactly what we should be doing. And look, no one has been a bigger champion for that exact concept than you and your team. So one small step that we can all take to elevate the voices of people who are doing that work, especially in the front lines where it matters, the courts, highly recommend for everybody watching right now to subscribe to Marc's YouTube channel. I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. Completely free to be able to do it, but helps elevate his voice, which is exactly what we need right now. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.